Can we kindly put our hands together and welcome this morning's keynote, the Archbishop Dr. Thabo Makgoba.
Thank you very much, Program Director, for your kind introduction. I think for me it suffices to say I'm just a pastor trying to be obedient to what God has called me to be in the context of the world. Thank you, CEO, for inviting me and the board chair, the board deputy chair, and really congratulations on organizing this day and convening this great panel. And thanks to everybody for being here. I took a 3 weeks leave, which is something that I normally don't do. And my body is used to really running and running. And I went to Japan, I climbed Mount Fuji, and I was not prepared to climb Mount Fuji. So when I saw Mr. Zulu, who died, I panicked, and I think my body went into shock, and I contracted flu, so my voice is a bit hoarse this morning, but I couldn't miss this special occasion for anything. So bear with me for my coarse voice this morning. As a preacher, I've been observing over the last couple of years since I've been a preacher that some of the preachers that teach the word and are objective about the word and try to encourage parishioners to be thinking parishioners, we tend to be in the minority compared to those preachers that say, I've got good and bad news. And the good news is this church has got a lot of money. And the bad news is that money is in your pocket. And we don't know as a church how to get it out of your pocket. And preachers who will also say, if you don't get that money out of that pocket, you're going straight to hell. And then people panic and they give the money. So I'm not one of those preachers, but I see that my numbers within the Anglican Church are dwindling because there's a cause for optimism. But those that say you're going straight to hell seem to be attracting more people. So it will seem pessimism is working in certain contexts. But I'll just leave that little story there. But I don't need to tell you that at this particular time in our national life, it is easier to put the case for pessimism about our future than it is to put that for being optimistic. Let's look at some of the biggest challenges that we face. Not because I want to focus on the negative, but because when I turn to the reasons for optimism, I will argue that every one of these challenges can be overcome if we focus our minds and our energies on doing so. What are the challenges currently? Let me just give you a few examples. We face in South Africa forces which threaten to pull us apart in a way we have not seen since the transition to democracy in the early years of the 1990s. There are disturbing signs of a return to violence as a way of handling political differences in parts of our country. Killings over councillors' jobs in some provinces are a reality almost too sad to swallow. There is what I call an epidemic of distrust between people and different backgrounds, with an upsurge of racism and narrow chauvinism. Our unemployment rate remains stubbornly high, and parts of our educational system are so dysfunctional that even when there are jobs, many young people are not equipped to do them. University administrators are warning us that the stopgap measures taken last year to deal with student unrest are not sustainable unless we are prepared to see a decline in the quality of teaching and research. In communities across the country, the failure to deliver basic services continue to set off social uprisings, many of them destructive violence. Some of those running our public broadcaster seek to hide this truth from our people by banning images of destruction and firing journalists who oppose this censorship. Good governance is threatened by failures ranging from inefficiency as a result of the appointment of people who cannot do their jobs, to corruption, which has reached endemic levels in certain parts of our government. A number of state-owned enterprises have become a drain on the economy. There is a growing pressure on the health system from HIV and AIDS, diabetes and tuberculosis, and parts of the system, like our educational systems, are plagued by institutional mismanagement. We learned at the recent AIDS conference in Durban last week that HIV infections are not declining in a meaningful way, when in some areas the infection rate decreases, in others it increases. We rely too much on testing and treatment, which do not necessarily lead to a change of attitude and behavior. Our prevention programs are not effective enough, and without education and personal counseling, we will have no effective behavior change. The Reserve Bank is predicting 0% growth in 2016, and unless everyone, including everyone in government, takes seriously what Minister Pravin Gordhan is urging us to do, our credit ratings will be downgraded and we will face the risk of recession, thus bringing misery to millions of people, particularly the poorest of the poor, the underemployed people, the unemployed youth. And apart from that, we are vulnerable to international forces over which we have little control. A drop in commodity prices, volatile currencies, and declining growth in emerging markets. Our environment is under assault from unscrupulous exploiters, foreign mining companies among them, who undermine and divide communities in order to get their way. There are other challenges, such as the drought affecting the subcontinent, but I think I have outlined enough to explain why we have lost the sense of anticipation and excitement we shared during the years of Mandela's presidency. Now, before you fall in your chairs, my task is not to give you a litany of those complaints and pessimistic issues. My task is to argue that in the midst of all these, we should have hope and optimism. The bottom line, dear friend, is that my hope and optimism for South Africa lies with you, with those who are gathered here today, with those of like mind, and especially with young people. On top of that, my hope lies in civil society, and in the strength of our institutions. I believe that if we look beyond the politicking of parties, whether during election season or not, every one of the challenges that I have been spelling out is being or can be addressed by bringing together the forces represented by all of you here, by the young, by civil society, including business, labor, religious communities, and environmental action groups, just to mention a few. They can be addressed by our institutions, including the judiciary and the Chapter 9 institutions of our Constitution. It is not as if we have to start from scratch in South Africa. People at every level, in every walk of life, are already carrying out countless acts of goodwill. But too many are doing so in silos. Where there is not enough action being taken, we need to form alliances. We need to combine their efforts into a force for progress. Let's take the role of young people. Despite our current challenges, we have tens and thousands of graduates who have become qualified over the past 20 years and who are full of energy and initiative and are either already taking on the world or are preparing to do so. Just to digress a bit, as University Chancellor at the University of the Western Cape, it never failed to surprise me when I see and hear the stories of young women from rural contexts whose families have sold cattle in order to take them to university, and they graduate with a doctoral degree. So there are good news stories out there. Whether you move in the commercial and business world or in the efficient sectors of the public service, you have to be impressed by the quality of young people we have. In the civil service, we have many good public servants who are working hard behind the scenes to deliver clean and efficient governance. When it comes to the fracturing of our communities, we have a rich heritage of experience, second to none in the world, in resolving conflict, whether in violence-torn communities or on the factory floor. Just think of the rise of trade unions in the 1980s, or the proliferation of peacemaking initiatives under the umbrella of the National Peace Accord in the 1990s. And so, given the competing interests at stake in election politics, perhaps it is time for civil society and the religious communities to step in again and draw on and resuscitate our peace-building skills. On the economy, there is more room for local-level initiatives in towns and rural areas for getting people together across traditional barriers to strengthen the informal sector and support emergent businesses. At the national level, the Minister of Finance is already working with business and labor to establish better conditions for investment and growth. In the area of healthcare, despite the management challenges we have enviable research and teaching expertise and policy objectives. And the AIDS conference last week have showed just how respected our health professionals are in the international arena. On the environment, South Africa has an impressive array of NGOs and activist groups, yourselves among them, Mornay, who are working diligently and effectively to use laws and regulations to protect our environment and guard against the abuse of our resources. And again, if I may digress, I was part of an interfaith, an interreligious group that worked for the last 5 years to mobilize people in Southern Africa towards the Congress of Parties 21 in Paris. I was intrigued at the religious tolerance within our country, something that we take for granted, at a number of youth groups that were willing to cycle across the country, collecting signatures that we delivered to COP21 in Paris to say, we want climate change now, we're calling for a decrease of up to 1% in temperatures, we want mitigation to happen, we want a climate change fund to help those that have been affected. So we've got a strong cadre of young people that are aware of green issues and environmental issues. So that is a cause for optimism. We have seen in recent months the importance of having strong independent institutions which guarantee the rights entrenched in our Constitution and uphold standards of good governance. We have also seen criticisms of the way in which we as society use those institutions. On the other hand, parties are criticized for what is called lawfare, that is, seeking to gain through the courts what they can't achieve through lobbying or the political process. It is true that disputes and problems can often be settled more amicably through dialogue than the courts. But then there must be a willingness to negotiate and seek win-win solutions to disputes. On the other hand, we see institutions engaging in long, drawn-out litigation over cases which cost the state huge sums of money but have no prospect of success. Fortunately, we are beginning to see signs that the judiciary will clamp down on this practice by making civil servants individually liable for legal costs when they pursue cases with no merit. And just one additional reason to be optimistic is that in South Africa today, we are realizing that we can't ignore the unemployed and the poor, that we must include them in our strategies for growth, that we can't rely only on the elite, the moneyed class, or the politically connected to achieve the change we want to see. The optimism for which I argue is not one which pretends things are not as they are. It does not depend on shallow, superficial statement that everything is rosy in the garden, in spite of the evidence that it is not. It assumes that achieving anything worthwhile for humanity and the world involves struggle, that nothing comes without it. And for me, as an Archbishop, my theological justification for hope is underpinned by an understanding and meaning of God's incarnation, which is that we are called to be present within the world with all its challenges and complexities, and that we should be engaging in what I call walks of witness and other activism to highlight social challenges such as the lack of toilets in poor areas, the lack of school buildings, and the crisis of student funding. We are called to exercise a prophetic witness, speaking out publicly to condemn corruption and to call for accountability. And we are called to help facilitate debate such as this and special dialogue on the role of religion and development. For example, there's a group here in Gauteng of business people that are about to set what we call South Africa Day, where they will create a day in the body politic of South Africa, in South Africa's journey, to sit back, enjoy who we are, rather than work each other. So watch this space. Again, as the religious people in South Africa, with the mining communities, we have set what we call courageous conversations, looking at the future of mining and how mining can be a source of good rather than a source that leaves gaping holes in our country. So, dear friends, let us be the change we want to see so that our children and grandchildren will give thanks for our role in building for them the kind of society in which they can flourish. In a spirit of realism about the challenges at hand, but with a hope born of faith that we can overcome them, let us get down to the urgent business of building the bright future we know is possible. I thank you.
Thank you, Archbishop. Can I ask you to please come join us on stage on the panel? We want more of those insights. I think you'd all agree that there was a very thoughtful state of the nation, really, about some of the macro issues that we have to deal with, but also a case for optimism. Maybe we can get the Arch next year to write the State of the Nation for us. I'm going to now ask each of our panelists to give their reaction to what they heard. I was watching them throughout the speech of the Archbishop, and they were listening very, very closely with interesting facial contortions throughout. And to translate that into words, I'm going to first ask Salim to kindly give us his reaction to those remarks.
I knew you were going to pick on me. No, I thought this was a very useful contribution. It certainly stimulated my own thoughts in terms of my role as an individual, my role within an organization, and outside of how we engage society. And I thought that, in a sense, what the Archbishop was presenting was to be able to have the ability to see the future in an environment of a total abyss, and to be able to take on consolidating what I thought you were talking about was that there's a lot of invisible power, micro power, that exists in society. You referred to the reversal of a decision that we saw in the courts with the SABC, where we have a single individual basically ruling over every decision in that, but that has been challenged in the courts. We've seen how a significant court judgment happened by our Chief Justice a couple of months back. We noticed that when we had the firing of the Minister of Finance, that decision was reversed. There's so many ways in which micropower is manifested in our society that tells us a story that it is not plain sailing for those who are in power and dominance to exert total authority over South Africa, which is very diverse. And I think the importance of that diversity, whether it's about sexuality, faith, ideology, and so on, it is a source and energy for the micropower that you talked about, this invisible sources of power that in one way or the other keeps our society together, even in this period of disillusionment, dysfunction, and feeling of hopelessness against state power, dominance of particular political parties, and so on. So I want to pick up on this theme of the importance of diversity. It's a source of energy for micropower, and it is something that I think you talked about, is how do we harness that to catalyze a reconfiguration of our society, to move out of sort of this myth of the Rainbow Nation, the post-Mandela era, which I think you've touched on, and the huge respect we have for Mandela. But we have to recreate a new society in the post-94 period. And I think there's sufficient sources of new energy. We've seen it with the students' protests, etc. And we are in a period of disruption, but also reinvention. And I think organizations like WWF recognize that, and we have to play an important role in rebuilding our society, given this many fractured, disorganized sources of micropower that we see.
Thank you, Salim. I was hoping your face would flash up there on the side. Can everyone see the panelists, or can you just hear them? Okay, we did give them the option of being seated, so I'm not going to put undue pressure on the other two. But in the event that they choose to, I would allow them to come to the podium, because I'm sure you'd like to see them and not just hear their brilliant insights. That said, thank you for giving us the first reaction, Salim, to the Archbishop's speech. I'm going to ask next Tasneem to share with us her thoughts and what went through her head as she listened to the keynote.
Thanks, Eusebius, and thank you very much, Archbishop, for your reflections. I thought that, of course, you captured much of the challenges, but the glimpses of hope, and I want to probably agree with one thing the most. The one big reason that I have, and this is where I agree with you, for optimism is, of course, the people. The one big reason that I have for pessimism is the people. So we've witnessed throughout history and to present day that humanity has both the ability to act with immense good and immense bad. And we're experiencing that right through to today. And in this nation itself, with all its diversity, we witness exactly the same thing. We have the potential for immense good, and I would think immense power. I'm not going to call it invisible. In fact, there's been an exciting blossoming of real, visible, and radical power that's reemerged. I mean, we struggled for that during our anti-apartheid struggle. We understood what power was of the people, and we're seeing that reemerge again, and rightly so. So I have immense hope in that people are saying no to very difficult challenges, but unjustifiable practices as well, and people are not willing to accept that. But then there's a whole body of people who are prepared to retreat into fear rather than solidarity. And so for me, the big theme here would be the kinds of optimism for the future would require of all of us to not retreat into fear. And it's not a South African problem alone. It's actually a global problem. We are seeing that retreat into fear at a global level. What's happening in the US right now is extremely worrying. What's happening in Europe is equally worrying. And it's this tendency to retreat into fear. And if we overlay all the challenges that you've described, Archbishop, of what we're experiencing in this country with the global crises of poverty, inequality, of climate change, for example, where again the poor are the most vulnerable, and that is unjust. If we cannot get human beings to stand in solidarity in the face of those global crises, then we unfortunately cannot be optimistic about that future. So the optimism of our future actually, as you rightly said, rests in our hands. And I think that the conversation we need to have is how do we ensure the best of us emerges and not the worst of us. So you see, that's the one point. The other point I want to bring into the debate is the fact that we do not have time any longer. We think we have the luxury of time, but things are becoming more urgent, not just because poverty and inequality are increasing at a rapid rate nationally, globally, But if you factor in ecological degradation, and part of that, a big aspect of that is, of course, climate change. And you, Archbishop, you're a global ambassador on climate change, and we appreciate your role. But it's clear the science is indicating that we don't have much time. So this is not like the general challenges we have, that we can spend our time with infrastructures negotiating, this future, with completely ignoring the urgency. So I would like to present something for the debate here today, and especially for our young people. Are we comfortable that for this optimistic future, and we continue in an incremental way to try and achieve change? Or is this the time, because humanity and the planet is at the crossroads? There are enough reports, and WWF presents many, many of those reports to prove that we are at a crossroads. Is this the time for incrementalism, or is this the time for radicalism? And I want to actually place that firmly on the agenda. And I would argue that the time for incrementalism, working within the existing status quo, is rapidly passing. And as human beings, as people who want real, meaningful change, to sort out these crises, we are going to have to be a bit radical about it. Actually, I would argue very radical about it. And so this is not me saying go and commit violence, but certainly being a radical in our actions, being a radical in our thinking, being a radical in actually saying a better world is possible, but defining what that looks like. And in that definition, putting those who are the most vulnerable in the world and in this country front and center of that radical agenda is what I think our challenge is, to ensure this optimism in the future and to deal with the challenges that you've presented. So I'm just placing some of the additional thoughts into what I hope will be a healthy debate on this matter. But thank you very much, Archbishop.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tasneem, obviously representing the flawless movements with all the radicalism. I'm going to next ask Clem to give us his initial input before I will invite you to engage the plentiful thoughts that have come from the panel. Clem?
Thanks, Eusebius. Hello? Is it on? It's on. No, it's not on. Is it on?
I think we can hear you, Clem.
Oh, you can hear me. Right. I would like to take a lot of the young people in this room back to a time when they either hadn't been born or were very young, which is the 1980s. Because when I listened to the Archbishop at the beginning and the litany of woes and challenges, it was very, very like that in the mid-80s in South Africa. And we did some scenarios in Anglo-American, which we called the high road and low road scenarios. The high road of negotiation to a new political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to a wasteland. And I remember that when I was asked to deliver scenario presentations to the public, a lot of people said, why is Anglo wasting the money on sending a person like you around the country to talk about the future when there is absolutely no way it's ever going to happen, in the sense that Nelson Mandela is still in prison and the National Party have made it very plain that they're never going to negotiate with the ANC. And I guess what changed people's minds was the crisis that had developed, and it was very much the Chinese proverb that in every crisis there is an opportunity. And that is what allowed the kind of change of thinking and the transition to take place. There was beginning to be an overwhelming sense of crisis in this country. And so we actually chose the right time to offer different possible futures for South Africa. And one of the, I think that the most prophetic things of our team, and really I have to thank Michael O'Dowd, who was the resident intellectual in Anglo in our company at the time, and Bobby Godsall, was that they always said that if we take the high road and negotiate a reasonable settlement, there is always a second crossroads, which will probably be around 20 years after the first one of achieving a proper political dispensation. And that is what they called the economic crossroads, where they said if we have a failure of economic growth, it can actually undo all the good stuff that we did politically. And I have to say that that is exactly where we are now. We have resolved the political system, we have a good constitution, but we do not have an economy that we can be proud of and goes with the political dispensation. We have a highly exclusive economy when what we need is a highly inclusive economy. And, you know, this is the moment that we have to grab rather than, as so eloquently put, retreating into fear. And the best thing to do in order not to retreat into fear is to reframe the perception of what is going on around us today. Because you can say that it is all going to turn out into a very nasty revolution leading to conflict and violence and possibly civil war. But on the other side, you can reframe it to basically say people are now have the same energy that they had in the 1980s to achieve the kind of radical changes that we need, rather than just going on incrementally on this second issue of our economy. And I therefore feel that you know, we can have a debate today about the kind of radical changes that people would like to see, because we're now back into that climate of uncertainty and crisis, where we can make another leap forward on the second front. We did the politics, everybody talked about the miracle in the world, and of course we had the right people at the right time to deliver that miracle. We actually now need that second miracle on the economic front. On the last issue I'd like to talk about, which is the environment, the kind of data that I'm getting out of my American colleagues on climate change is that it is happening much faster than we think, and that you're seeing extreme weather events which are beginning to really impact on people's ordinary lives. I just give you one that I came across, two that I came across recently. Texas has had 2 1-in-500-year rainfalls in the space of 3 months. I mean, this, because of Mr. Trump and everything else, has just not really been spoken of very much. But I mean, to have Houston and Austin both, you know, totally flooded out because of 1-in-500-year rainfalls in 3 months is enormous. But on the other side, the drought in places like California has been partially ameliorated by El Nino rains. But in the last 2 weeks, the temperatures in California and Arizona have been spectacular, with one reading in Arizona of something like 53 degrees centigrade, and that is the record temperature ever registered in the United States outside of Death Valley. And a lot of people are saying that actually, if we don't do things now, it is in our children's lifetime that the planet is actually going to become very uncomfortable because of these extreme weather events. And out of every crisis there is an opportunity. If it had been a sort of slow roast, people wouldn't have actually started saying we've got to do something. Necessity would not have been the mother of invention. But I do believe that on the climate change front, that the crisis is going to lead to some very radical thoughts about trying to move to a lifestyle that excludes carbon emissions. So that's why we have cause for optimism. We have a crisis in terms of recreation of our economy into something much more inclusive to go with our political system, and we certainly have a crisis with climate change. and therefore the need for some radical thinking on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Clem. Okay, folks, I'm going to give you a chance to give some inputs. Can we have the roving mics? If you put up your hands, then I will recognize you. I think we will agree that the conversation so far is very broad with lots of themes, and that's the way it should be, because, of course, the reality is that we need a synoptic approach to our problems in this country. We can't be piecemeal about it. We are, however, as South Africans, very good, I think, for the most part, at diagnosing our ills. Dare I say it, I think we're also pretty good at coming up with policy visions. But the question is, how do we get there? How do we harness the energies that our panel is talking about? How does that translate into action that is feasible for us to do? And that certainly is what's top of mind at this point of the conversation. Do I see any hands? The conversation digitally, by the way, is going very well. We are trending number 2 in the country, and some interesting critical responses online. It's often the other way around. So I'd like to get more conversation going in here and just to decenter it away from the stage over to yourselves. I can't really see who has the mics at the moment. Yes? Oh, okay. Okay, while you are warming up, maybe I will role model how to make some input and ask a question. So I was wondering, in terms of that miracle, Archbishop, that Clem is talking about, the economic miracle, we've been using that language for a long time. What gave me some optimism during your remarks is when you pointed to the fact that we have short memories as South Africa. We've exported the CODESA model as a model for incredible dialogue between folks who seem to have disparate political interests, who managed to actually reach consensus in the end. And the language of a political miracle, I think, is not an exaggeration, Clem. I think that is probably apt. Why is it, though, that we don't seem to be able to extract those lessons in a very practical way and then apply it to the economy? We seem to, for example, have a trust deficit when it comes to the relationship in this country between labor, business, civil society, and the state. And if the interlocutors around a problem that you're trying to solve don't really secretly have a certain level of necessary trust that you can be a winning partner in dialogue with someone else that you need to be in dialogue with, then surely we will never be able to really harness those lessons from the 80s and bring it to bear on the economy question.
Thank you very much for that. I think the issue also of terminology is very important. You know, as a theologian, I mean, if we were to approach the economic issues by calling it the economy of life, you're already placing an interesting emphasis on the economic question. And it propels the youth that are unemployed to also do something rather than to wait for the crumbs to fall, either from the government's purse or to fall from what I call the moneyed elite. Because if you look at it this way, I mean, the South African economy is structured such that there are those that are moneyed, old money, and they control the purse. We have the politically connected. They hope that the bigger crumbs will fall on them, and then they will bring those that vote for them into controlling the economy. They form the second tier. We've got the majority who are unemployed, poor, waiting for the political liberators to bring something on the table. And if you look at the whole cake relies on old models, probably, that were devised by, for lack of a better term, colonial masters in the 18-something, when they had colonies all over Africa to ensure that raw material is taken from the colonies into the bigger centers. And then we are all quibbling around this small cake and hoping that it will expand one day. Maybe we need a radical transformation of the economic model and how we do things. I think the US in 17-something broke away from being a colony of Britain, and they are the probably one economy power that are not tied to the old colonial masters. That is the first thing. But the second thing is we always wait for somebody to do something. When I look at the young people in Makgoba's Kloof, where I originally come from, beautiful country, lots of avocados, lots of fruits, and I mean, if we encourage them to form small cooperatives and work with the farmers there, we could break the unemployment there. So we need to have freeing models, conversations that empower others, but also common sense needs to be one of the values that we promote within our national psyche.
Okay. Do we have a question? Or you just poised there? Tasnim, okay, while we get the mic there, when we talk about radicalism, okay, you've told us what it's not. It's not violence, it's not destruction of artifacts at UCT. What is it, programmatically and practically?
Yeah. I think the starting point would be something that the Archbishop just said. It's us actually interrogating this economic model. You know, we've been so fixated, and let me confess, I'm also a commissioner in the National Planning Commission, so I'm not talking in that capacity. I'm talking as an independent-minded person. We've been very fixated with the idea of economic growth, economic growth, economic growth. And yes, of course, we do need to have growth, but not the way that we see growth and define growth now. Because in fact, it is exactly this economic model, not just in South Africa, but in the rest of the world, that has placed us in this current crisis. I think there's some famous quote that Albert Einstein had about, you know, you don't fix things by doing the things that you usually do, kind of thing. I don't know the exact quote. But so we have to learn from that. And I am optimistic exactly because now, because of these different crises coming together, there is a moment for us to rethink everything. And I think it is a moment for us, if we did have a CODESA, an economic CODESA, and I don't mind if people don't trust each other. You know, you don't have to come to a table to have those difficult conversations if you all trust each other. I think it's exactly because we don't trust each other that we have to get to those tables and have the hard conversations. But in such a conversation, I think we should say the agenda is wide open, that we are not actually going to be looking at the economy from the usual standpoint, that it's growth at all costs, etc., that it's the current productive and consumption patterns that we have to just, you know, tweak here and there, but that we're actually looking at alternative models for economic development. And in that, the solutions are there, Eusebius. So I don't think we, you know, it's the common sense that you speak about, Archbishop. We talk very big. We're very big. South Africa's really good at this. We love big infrastructure. We love big stadiums, big dams, big everything. And yet, this power of the local is probably where we could explore new things. The renewable energy projects, for example, the REAP project that Eskom is now threatening to relook at, which would be unfortunate, but that's big and it's great that we're doing that. But there are also models, for example, in the rest of the world where there's community-owned renewable energy systems, completely off the grid, not dependent on some big fat utility, but they empowered, they in control. The ownership and control models of energy, of your livelihoods, etc., all of that must be up for grabs for rethinking and reshaping and reimagining. And I believe that is there in the minds of our young people and also some of us old people, I think. So don't write us off completely. But that's what I'm talking about. This is that. And yes, of course, the radicalism will have radical action. I'm not precluding that, Eusebius, because we've come through struggle. Struggle is exactly that struggle. There are going to be points at which radicalism will take different forms. But now is the time for us to actually have radical thought and radical action in a solutions-oriented way. That's the challenge I'd like to put out to all of us. I'm not, of course, sitting here with all the solutions, but that's why we have great thinkers in the room as well.
And you are one of them. Okay, now the hands are coming. Okay, now you have warmed up as we're marching closer towards tea. It always happens. This gentleman over here has got the mic, and then I'm going to come to the aisle there with the lady.
Thank you to WWF and the panel for hosting us. My name is Gwandile Sikosana, and I'm a prospective president. I have a community initiative. I want to talk about two things.
Well done.
I'm going to talk about two things that I do. Firstly, I've got a community initiative. It's called the Davidson Book Club. And through my sponsors, I have an excess of 2 million books. Last year, we trained about 500 people in project management with Insurance CETA. But a lot of people are asking me this one question. We have trained, we've got a certificate, but what's next? We cannot talk about economical transformation without education. We cannot talk about political willingness without education, because there's a very large political unwillingness amongst community-driven initiatives and the youth. And it's not every day that you can sit with CEOs and people with financial power. So what I'm saying is, since that I'm here, what is the CEOs doing to empower us as the youth in terms of information about how do we form parts of your databases? How do we ensure that we get financial aid for the things that we do? Because with my community initiative, I would like to start more libraries in disadvantaged communities. I'd like to do more, and I'd like to distribute my books amongst a lot of people in the country. But I find that with the little funds that are given to people like me, I have to stop. And there's a lot of people with great ideas to empower and economically equip people, but they find that they run out of that zeal because they don't have the financial power to continue with the works. So my thing is, how do we make sure that we distribute the information? Because not everyone can be part of this conference, not everyone can ensure that they sit amongst CEOs to talk about these things and form networks. But how can you make sure that you distribute the information amongst other people? And then another thing that I'm working on is to establish a university in Ekurhuleni. What I'm saying with the Black Pen University Initiative, and we're working with a lot of people, and the mayor is also part of our structure. He only comes every 3 months to say, okay, we'll have another meeting. And that's another thing that stops development. If you're going to say we're going to have another meeting in 3 months, then you come after 3 months to telling us you're going to have another meeting in 3 months. You don't necessarily think of the impact that it has on our plans and our development. Because 6 months or 12 months in a year, that's already dampening the progress of the whole thing. So what I'm saying is, us as people who are here and we're talking about radical change, what can we do as people, as individuals, to make sure that we foster this change that we're talking about? Because it's one thing, it's fancy to talk about change and then leave after lunch and talk about other things, but what are we committing ourselves to ensure that there is this change that we're talking about? Because I'll be in Davidson tomorrow, and I don't know if this conference is going to benefit me directly. But if it will connect me, or if it will ensure that it helps me in the things that I do, I would like to know how. And is it really sustainable? Will WWF be in contact with all of us to ensure that with the network that they're forming today, they'll be ensure that tomorrow becomes a brighter future for the people of the next generation or my generation, in ensuring that they help us with these things that we don't know of. Because you've been in the business for long. I mean, I'm seeing your CVs here. It's very insightful and it's very powerful. But how will you use what you know to empower someone like me, who's only starting out? So basically, that's my comment.
Thank you, Mr. President. There was a hand up there, yes, and then I'm going to come to the back.
King himself. They have, the Thai word is moso, and what it is a sufficiency economy. So they have a sufficiency economy philosophy for the country. And what it is, their wording is development based on moderation, prudence, and social immunity that uses knowledge and virtue as guidance in harmonious living. And I thought that was very powerful because it infuses all of society, Thai society. It infuses everything that they approach coming from that one philosophy. So as South Africans, do we have a similar philosophy? Can we create our own philosophy that will infuse the new economy that we're talking about? Because what you mentioned about the micro power, when a pot of boiling water boils, it's not when there are lots of bubbles, it's when the first bubbles start boiling, the water is boiled. The point is that we don't need to get 100% of people in the country on board, or even 50%. 4% is the tipping point. If you could just reach 4% buy-in, you then create such incredible momentum from that point onwards. So the case for optimism is, it's not so daunting that you have to have everybody on board. You could just work with 4%, and from there, it escalates with its own momentum.
Thank you. Hold on, I'll come to you in 1 second. I did recognize the lady right at the back, and then I'm coming to you, and then the gentleman to my left. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jane Simmons. I work in the public health sector. A lot of what has been said ties in with poverty and with youth. And I think we can't address the problems of the world or the environment without recognizing the issues of poverty and youth. And a lot of pressure is being put on youth. But yet, if one works in communities, and I'm empathizing with the man who's working in Davidson, I work in Alex, you know, there is an environment there that is incomprehensible to people who are trying to save a larger environment of the World Wildlife Fund. And I think without the buy-in of communities and local communities, we cannot sustain any type of change and community change. And that comes, I think, very strongly from recognizing the poverty and the limited choices that people have in this country, in particular the youth, who are looking at massive unemployment future. You know, and I don't know the answers, but I think we need to look at the picture of working with communities and people in as much as we're looking at the environment, because I don't think environmental change can be sustained or protected without engaging with poverty and the youth. Not being a youth, I'd like to say I'm also part of it. And I think we must remember that even older people matter too. But just, you know, I think that has been said, and I'd like to keep that open as a place for us to keep in mind. We can't bring that change without engaging with the issues of the country and globally, those issues of poverty.
Popping bottles already.
Greetings, fellow Earthlings.
Okay, that one is not on. Can we get the other one there quickly? Yes.
Greetings, fellow Earthlings. Foremost, I am an Earth keeper and a guardian of our Mother Earth and our Father Skies. And and integrally I work with the Kung, Kwe and Kumani San Bushman people in the Northern Cape. We're part of the Sun Dispute Resolution Project, which is a part of the College of Law of UNISA. It's a multidisciplinary research institute. And as a pragmatic, not solution, but moving forward, what I've learned with working with these people and working with many healers and wise people for the last 2 years is that we need to really listen to the medicine people, the wise people, the religious and spiritual leaders in these communities, because they have wisdom. They're wisdom keepers, and they have access to knowledge and wisdom from our past and projecting into our future, culminating in the present. So this is what I'm really learning with our Sun Dispute Resolution Project, to work together as in resolving conflicts, intra-community and inter-community conflicts, is that a lot of the knowledge and the ways forward with the wisdom keepers. And as to build on what everyone has said, it's not just the young people. It's multi-generational. And yeah, that's my contribution. And it is pragmatic because in research, it's community-based participatory research. So it's research by the community for the community. And so we are focusing very much on this wisdom, this ancient and modern wisdom, to integrate it into policy making and integrating it into the law and to the judiciary. So it's these multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary ways that we can integrate. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take a final comment for now from the floor. The gentleman over there, just get the mic to the other side, to your left. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Louis Smith. I've been involved with WWF for 16 years now on a consultancy basis. And I go to AGMs and conferences, and I always see the usual suspects, I like to call them, the same faces, and it's always the same people. So before I comment on that, I think I would also like to comment on the positive. Seeing that we are here for a case of optimism, I think what Salim and Tasneem said about the legal system, I am in the legal field. A lot of people are negative, but I think if I have to comment, and this last year, discussions with fellow colleagues and so on, my opinion has always been, you know what, doesn't matter what happens in the country, we still have a legal system that we can go to, maybe not on the lower levels, but if you go to the high courts and constitutional courts and stuff like that, I mean, the judgments and stuff that are given is really good, and and I think it's good for civil society, and I'm not going to elaborate on that. Everyone who read the news or see the news know what we are talking about. For me, I would like to maybe say, how do we broaden our conservation base, regular people? I think it links up with a lot of people, or a lot of things that people have said here, whether it's old people, young people, it doesn't matter. Myself, I'm just thinking of my personal friends, and how many of them are really involved in conservation. I can honestly tell you very few. Yes, we all like to go to the bush and stuff like that, but how do we make those small changes? And I would actually like the floor to ask people here, how many people at their own houses have solar panels? Maybe they don't have to put up their hands now, but how do we broaden the base of conservation network? And it links up with what the lady said. I think she was from Dischem. She talked about that 4%, and I think if we try and there's that whole thing about paying it forward. If we as individuals just try and broaden the conservation base within our own friend network, I think that will be absolutely brilliant. And I've just made a couple of notes while everyone's talking, and I'm sorry that the gentleman from Sun International has left, but again, how do we make it easy for normal people to be involved in conservation? Now, Sun International said that they're going to stick to the basics. So, and this is not criticism, but it's small things. These little notepads that we've got, it's 10 pages of paper printed on one side. So how do we change it to 5 pages? It's the little basics. How do we change people to recycle, to get involved in the solar at their homes themselves? So, and I think for me that's a critical thing, because sometimes I feel that conservation is too difficult, or giving a positive contribution towards conservation is too difficult for the ordinary man on the street. And I know there's different levels of income, education, etc. But through the bank, I think that's, for me, a really important thing.
Thank you. Thank you for your input. Particularly enjoy your comment about the law. I used to like the word lawfare, but I don't anymore because I think it gives the judiciary an unacceptably negative connotation. Yesterday I was part of a documentary being filmed about the Pistorius trial. Sadly, I agreed to it. And one of the questions the director asked me was whether there's anything optimistic to be said about the judicial system coming out of the trial. And of course, the one thing, which is not specific to criminal law, I think in the context of today's discussion, this is particularly true of the Constitutional Court, is that we also take for granted when we do that checking in with how we are getting on as a country, what it means to live in a country where constitutional supremacy is entrenched as a principle. That was one of the revolutionary breaks with the previous government in 1994. And the double-edged nature of all the legal cases is that on the one hand, it means we don't have the kind of bottom-up community-based collaboration and buy-in that Tasneem is talking about. On the other hand, it's also one of the things we should be optimistic about. The fact that the rule of law can be entrenched and constitutionalism is respected is actually one of the beautiful things about our country that we also take for granted. Okay, we're going to run out of time, but I'm really, really pleased with the quality of the dialogue that we've been generating in the room. I do want to acknowledge some of the comments that are coming through from elsewhere, from folks who are not in the room, or just some of you who have tweeted comments and questions, even if you are in the room. And we won't have time to engage all of these. Our panelists are not gurus. We are here as equals in this conversation, but I will give them an opportunity to react in 1 or 2 minutes as we wrap up this session to anything that have stuck with them or however they'd like to spend those 2 minutes. But before I do that, here are some of the tweets that have come through. And questions as well for the panelists, but you don't have to answer all of them. So Sun says, South Africa, are farmers unfairly being asked to carry the cost of common pool natural resources? Can the value chain help? Poor tweets, African agriculture is water intensive. Is there a way we could increase efficiency into the section? Jarisna, I hope I say the name right. Are we ready to make regional trade-offs on biodiversity to ensure food security? And we've got another one here from Nathan who says, how can South Africa's youth be empowered when discrimination and unrealistic job requirements are rife when it comes to the working sector in this country? Then a last one here. Someone called Augustine. I wonder who that is. Why must our democracy be defined by radicalism? Why have we arrived here? Why must we shout in order to be heard? So some really great input there digitally. Thank you so much for those of you who have given those. Salim, I'm going to start with you because we will lose you after tea to the floor, but you'll still be in the room. What are some of the thoughts that have come up with you as we've generated the dialogue in the room?
I'd like to maybe pick up on some of the invisible conversations that are going on. And they are there's very interesting groups of people at different universities getting together, radical, heterodox economists, conservative economists, to actually have a conversation about, very difficult conversations about how do you change South Africa's economy to make it more inclusive. There are fault lines. And some of those fault lines got to do with issues around deficit spending, the operations of state institutions, the extractive model that the private economy is engaged in, which is about short-termism, shareholder value. Lots of fault lines that puts blame on different parties for the problems in the economy. But I do think that there's an opportunity for consensus, given the crisis that we have, to try to shift our economy from being one of people extracting value at both public and private level, and it's privatized in both cases, individuals in government privatizing state resources for their own purposes, and people in the private economy privatizing for their own benefit. To shift that kind of extractive way of creating value to true value creation, which is the big debate that heterodox economists are talking about. There is room for radicalism, but not in the kind of ones that you imagine taking land away, ownership. That is some version of the radicalism that we do see people are talking about. This idea that just ownership will solve the problem. Ownership can just encourage new forms of extractivism. Again, privatization of those benefits in the name of public interest. So we have to be careful about what kinds of radicalism we are talking about. And I think the real debate is relating to what you're talking about, Tasneem, and Clem has talked about, is in the space that we operate in, is how do we solve the shift in our energy economy, how do we revision our bioeconomy, the way we deal with water resources and so on. There is room for lots of radical innovation, new kinds of investment to up the scale, to move away from incrementalism to fast-tracking many of the available innovations that exist, but there is also need for new innovation. And really this is an international problem that I just want to reflect on because of some of the work I'm doing on international finance. The debate in some of the scholars is that in the last 30 years, finance has largely been involved in short-termism, rent-seeking, extractivism, and not spending like we did in the early periods of the post-World War II period, where a lot of money went into the real economy, reconstruction, the building of new kinds of infrastructure, manufacturing capability, etc., which you're referring to, the radical shift in the US with the policies of Alexander Hamilton and so on, that shifted US policy becoming supporting infant industry development and industrialization. So we need a new kinds of fourth generation industrialization that we're not really investing in because lots of money is following not real economy investment, but this sort of unearned income that comes from expanding the credit bulge, housing bubbles, etc. And there's real serious scholarship going on how to make that shift happen. And interestingly, the debate, the mainstream economists argues that actually the state needs to be the leader in this. But for the state to be the leader, it has to be governed in the right manner. It has to be able to account for the performance of how state money is used and allocated through state enterprises and so on. If we can make finance shift to, and the state leading that way with private money following, we've seen that with renewables. There's some radical things happening now with nuclear coming in. It's also a low carbon solution, Tasneem. We should support it. There's a radicalism in Eskom happening that wants to wipe out renewables and bring nuclear into the picture. So we should try to stop that kind of state radicalism to something else. So I think really the shift from getting finance to operate more in financing the real economy, creating these spaces for radical economic new kinds of investment and development, I think those are the areas we should be focusing on.
Okay. Thank you, Salim, Tasneem, and Clem. I'm going to give you guys a pass in the interest of time and also because you will be back with us after tea on the panel. But I'm going to ask the Archbishop to just give us a closing thought and to restrict yourself kindly to 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. As a preacher, 2 minutes is a challenge, but South Africans tend to want a solution now. And as a person of faith, I know this is a long journey. If you look at our story, it's been a long story, full of ups and downs. And the sense of hope and optimism is we've never stayed in one place. We've always been shifting. So keep on going back and looking at the story. Tell the story. Put the story in the mirror. But ask yourself, what is my role as an individual South African? Will I trap myself in debilitating fear? Or will I step out and make the change that I want to see in South Africa? So there lies in my sense of optimism that you are there, we are all South Africans, and we can do it as a collective. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Salim for being a panel member. Salim always impresses me with his incredibly economical use of language, but packs a lot of granular detail into it. So we really appreciate your contribution on the panel. And also, in particular, I'd like to thank the Archbishop, our keynote this morning, and then the entire panel. Can we put our hands together for them, please?